They came in a single, sharp sweep, a new layer of pressure intended to choke off one of Tehran's most vital lifelines. In recent days, Washington quietly expanded a sanctions campaign aimed not at oil fields inside Iran, but at the customers, the middlemen, and the tankers that move the crude around the world. The targets included a major independent Chinese refinery, a coastal complex able to process roughly 400,000 barrels of crude a day, and roughly 40 shipping companies and vessels that U.S. officials say are linked to what they call Iran's shadow oil network. The move is deliberate and precise. Instead of trying to stop every barrel at source, the campaign seeks to make the downstream business of buying, transporting, and selling Iranian crude too risky, too costly, or too exposed to Western financial systems. The Treasury's actions singled out buyers and facilitators, refiners that have taken significant volumes of Iranian oil, shipping firms that have moved it, and Awebo, and intermediaries that help to hide the chain of custody. Taken together, the measures are meant to form a financial vice around Iran's oil exports. To understand why that matters, follow the oil Iran produces as crude. Middlemen move it, foreign buyers refine it and sell the products. Removing one link can make the chain more expensive and more visible, but removing the link entirely is harder. Iran's trade has proven remarkably adaptable, a shifting choreography of ship-to-ship transfers, quick changes of a vessel's flag or name, offshore intermediaries, and informal banking arrangements that all combine to keep exports flowing and cash coming back to Tehran. The new sanctions are designed to raise the cost of that choreography. The targeted Chinese refinery was described by U.S. Refinery officials as a large independent processor that has been buying Iranian crude since at least 2023. Those sales officials contend generated hundreds of millions of dollars that ultimately benefited NTT. Ties linked to Iran's military network. For Washington, that is key. Sanctions are not just about energy markets. They are a national security tool aimed at choking off funds used to buy weapons, to train proxies, and to support operations across the region. China sits at the center of this dispute. Analysts and tracking groups have for years reported that China takes the lion's share of Iranian oil exports, a dominant buyer that in recent years has received the vast majority of Tehran's shipments. Much of that trade does not flow through the national oil giants, but through so-called independent or teapot refiners. These private processors, smaller than state-owned refineries, but often flexible and aggressive on price, account for a substantial slice of China's refining capacity. They have been eager customers for heavily discounted crude because buying at a discount allows them room to profit through fuel sales and blending. From the U.S. perspective, however, the business mode of some of these independent refiners has a darker side. By accepting discounted Iranian crude, they help keep Tehran's export revenues alive. U.S. officials argue that cutting off major buyers, even those outside the state sector, will squeeze Iran's room to maneuver. But how do cargoes get from Iran to these refineries without leaving a clear trail? Enter the so-called shadow fleet. These are tankers that operate at the margins, older ships whose ownership records are opaque, vessels that switch flags regularly, and ships that frequently turn off automatic identification systems to hide their position. They stage rendezvous at sea for ship-to-ship transfers, moving oil from sanctioned tankers into different hulls, or they offload onto smaller tankers that can slip into ports with less scrutiny. Shipping companies and front entities sprout and melt away. Paper companies on offshore registries reappear under new names. The ships targeted in this round of sanctions are the connecti, the tissue of that system. By blacklisting these vessels and the companies that own or operate them, the U.S. aims to make it harder for the tankers to secure insurance, obtain port services, access maintenance and finance, or transact in dollars through major banks. The theory is straightforward. If a ship cannot be insured or refueled, it cannot move oil easily. If a buyer or a bank fears secondary sanctions, penalties applied for doing business with an entity already sanctioned, they will be less likely to provide services that keep the system running. Beijing predictably pushed back. Chinese officials and state media called the move an overreach and illegal unilateral measure. They said that tries to impose Washington's rules on the rest of the world. From Beijing's point of view, Chinese refiners buy oil on the open market and do so to feed domestic demand and to run legitimate commercial businesses. Chinese banks and businesses, they insist, should not be punished for wing their own laws and regulations. The American response to that argument is to point to how modern finance works. Even when transactions are denominated in currencies other than the dollar, the global banking system remains interwoven with U.S. institutions. Dollars flow through correspondent accounts in New York. International banks maintain relationships with American banks banks. Consequently, U.S. authorities argue the leverage is real, and they have warned that Chinese banks could face secondary penalties if they knowingly process funds tied to designated Iranian transactions. Diplomacy complicates the picture further. The sanctions came on the eve of another round of U.S.-Iran diplomatic talks. On the one hand, the timing highlights a classic Washington tactic, pressuring the other side in parallel with negotiation, using economic tools to strengthen the bargaining position. On the other, it risks escalating tensions at precisely the moment when talks might otherwise build momentum. From Tehran's perspective, sanctions that target commercial partners and third country companies can harden positions and reduce incentives to bargain. From the U.S. vantage point, applying pressure during talks can be a way to extract concessions without resorting to military options. Will these sanctions work? The answer is both simpler and more complicated than it sounds. In the short term, they will disrupt parts of Iran's trade. Designated refineries will find it harder to buy Iranian crude openly. Sanctioned vessels become less useful once insurers and shipyards no longer want to touch them. Middlemen, the brokers, shell companies, and shipping managers will lose some of their usual cover. That creates friction, raises costs, and can deter casual or opportunistic buyers who do not have the appetite for sanctions risk. But Iran and the networks that support its exports are not standing still. When pressure closes one route, actors skilled in sanctions evasion look for hers. They swap vessels, use new intermediaries, reroute money through smaller banks, rely on cash settlements, or seek partners in jurisdictions that are less likely to cooperate with U.S. enforcement. Black markets, physical and financial, spring up to exploit regulatory gaps. The shadow fleet is a nimble organism. Blocking a few vessels can slow it, but it rarely stops it. There's also an economic calculation at play. Global oil markets are deep and resilient. A drop in Iranian crude getting to a handful of refiners can be absorbed by other suppliers or by the same buyers shifting to alternative sellers. That means the sanctions campaign is not just an attempt to choke supply, it is a strategy to elevate the political and reputational costs of dealing with Iran. The hope from Washington's vantage is that persistent pressure will eventually narrow the universe of willing counterfeiters until Tehran's revenues decline meaningfully. At the same time, the campaign raises hard questions for companies and governments caught in the middle. For Chinese refiners, the calculus is commercial. Discounted crude often means higher margins. Cutting off a cheap feedstock can hit profitability and refining economics. For global shipping firms, the calculus is operational and legal. Engaging with the shadow fleet risks being cut off from the mainstream insurance and finance systems that most maritime businesses rely on. For banks outside the United States, there is a constant weighing of the benefits of doing business with sanction-linked entities against the possibility of being shut out of U.S. markets or facing secondary measures. And then there is the regional strategic calculation. Iran's revenues pay for much more than oil exports. They support a defense apparatus, a network of regional proxies, and a domestic budget that underwrites political stability. Reducing those revenues, in theory, constrains Iran's foreign policy reach. But sanctions can also push Iran toward Third, further self-reliance or toward deeper economic cooperation with states that are willing to insulate it from pressure that can produce an opposite effect, a hardened, diversified revenue stream that is harder to touch. For ordinary people inside Iran, sanctions can have blunt effects. Fuel shortages, inflation, and economic dislocation tend to affect citizens more than elites. That is a moral and strategic dilemma for policymakers who want to pressure a regime while limiting humanitarian consequences. Smart sanctions try to thread that needle, targeting the financial flows that underwrite military and illicit activity while preserving humanitarian channels. But in practice, the line is often blurry. Internationally, the sanctions illustrate another enduring fact of contemporary geopolitics: the interconnectedness of trade, finance, and strategic rivalry. The tool of sanctions is most effective when backed by shared norms and multilateral enforcement. When key players disagree, when major purchasers of oil resist pressure, unilateral sanctions face limits. That is why U.S. officials often try to pair punitive measures with diplomatic outreach, multilateral coalition building, and public disclosure of illicit activity. The goal is to make evasion more politically costly and operationally risky. Back in the shipping lanes, enforcement regimes are adapting too. Satellite tracking, tanker monitoring firms, and non-governmental investigators have become very good at flagging suspicious activity, transporter blackouts, unusual voyage patterns, and repeated ship-to-ship transfers at particular coordinates. That kind of public exposure has a chilling effect. Even if a vessel is not formally sanctioned, repeated public allegations can make insurers raise premiums or ports restrict services. In that way, transparency can be a tool to shrink the shadow fleet's operating space. Yet for every tactic deployed against the network, there is a counter tactic. If insurers refuse to cover blacklisted ships, owners switch to mutual or state-backed insurers. If ports deny access, ships loiter at sea to transship cargoes. If one bank cuts off a channel, financial flows are rerouted through smaller banks, crypto-like instruments, or physical cash. It is an ongoing contest, and the outcome depends on resources, political will, and the ingenuity of actors on both sides. The sanctions also prompt a broader question about global governance. Should the use of unilateral secondary sanctions to police another country's buyers become a standard tool? Critics argue that it risks weaponizing global finance and placing undue burdens on third-party economies. Proponents counter that when a state systematically flouts international obligations and funds malign activities, targeted economic pressure is one of the few non-military levers available to the international community. For journalists and citizens listening in, the core of the story is not the headlines about a single refinery or a list of dark-sailed tankers. It is a story about leverage, limits, and adaptation. It's about how states and companies behave when the rules of the global system are contested. It's about the cost of doing business in a world where strategic competition and commercial calculations collide. Looking ahead, expect more rounds of designations and more diplomatic sparring. Expect Tehran to seek new buyers and new routes, and expect Beijing and other trading partners to publicly condemn measures they view as overreach while privately weighing their exposure. Expect the shadow fleet to evolve. Older vessels will be retired, new ones recruited, and avoidance tactics will become more sophisticated. And expect enforcement to continue to be a mixture of public naming and shaming, legal designations, and quiet diplomacy aimed at persuading banks, insurers, and port operators to limit their exposure. Ultimately, sanctions are a means, not an end. Their effectiveness will be measured not only in the volume of oil stuck in storage or the number of vessels blacklisted, but in whether they alter the strategic calculations of the actors involved. Do the costs imposed on Tehran change the behavior that alarmed policymakers in the first place? Do the penalties deter the buyers and facilitators who enable the trade? Or do the pressures simply rewrite the same flows, adding a layer of complexity while leaving the underlying dynamics intact? The broader question remains stark. Can sanctions truly stop the flow of Iranian oil, or will they simply rewrite it? History suggests both outcomes are possible at the same time. Sanctions can impose meaningful short-term pain and can disrupt specific networks, but where there is incentive and expertise, where smuggling and financial workarounds are already industrialized, supply chains adapt. The challenge for policymakers is to make adaptation costly enough and persistent enough that the behavior they seek to change eventual. Our new security initiative becomes unsustainable. For now, the latest wave of dissonance is a clear escalation in a long-running campaign. It tightens the screws on the most exposed commercial links and forces actors from refiners to ship owners to banks to reassess their risk assumptions. Whether that recalibration is sufficient to achieve Washington's strategic goals is an open question. What is certain is that the contest will continue to play out in boardrooms, in the murky waters of international shipping lanes, and in the courtroom of global finance. And for anyone watching, the story will remain a vital measure of how power, profit, and principle interact in an interconnected world.